For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. Did anyone see the movie 80 for Brady? If you didn't, don't watch it. And if you did, like I did, which you can watch my review of by clicking the card in the upper right corner, my condolences. The movie is about 4 Tom Brady fans who travel from Boston down to Houston for Super Bowl 51. Believing that this could be their last chance to see their favorite quarterback play in the Super Bowl. It's based on a true story, but only incredibly loosely, as a lot of things happen that, simply put, could not happen in real life. However, I bring this bad movie up because there's one scene in that movie where the 4 ladies, frustrated with how the game was going with the Pats down 28-3, leave their seats and somehow sneak into the coach's box where Matt Patricia is calling the plays on defense. Yes, that is actually a real thing that happens in the movie. Then, the ladies start calling the plays, and it actually works. Again, this could not possibly happen in real life, but you get the idea. This is a moment where a fan has a direct influence on the game. A fan is calling the shots. A fan is making decisions for the team that impact what happens on the field. Speaking of decisions, make sure to make the decision to hit that like button down below, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We're trying to reach 60,000 subscribers and build the best football community on YouTube, where we talk all things NFL history all the time. Your support would be greatly appreciated. Thanks in advance. And I bring all of that up because something like that actually sort of happened 4 decades ago in 1986 with this game right here. Seriously. In 1986, the Los Angeles Raiders were taking on the Dallas Cowboys, and one fan was so fed up with his team's performance that he decided to do something about it. He didn't fire off on a forum or on Twitter, even though Twitter obviously didn't exist back then. He didn't call into his local radio station to complain. He called Al Davis directly in the middle of the game and told him to do something about it, only for the Raiders to actually take his suggestion. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest fan moments in NFL history, and how a fan actually had a direct influence on the game at hand. Sort of. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of the game at hand, how the game was going, and what the build-up to this game was like, so we can understand the fans' motives a bit better. It's November 9th, 1986. It's week 10 of the NFL season. And as we're in the second half of the year, we've got a big interconference battle on our hands down at Texas Stadium between the Los Angeles Raiders and the Dallas Cowboys. This was the biggest game on the Sunday slate. This was the 4 o'clock game with Dick Enberg and Merlin Olsen on the call for NBC. So you know it's a big deal. In one corner, you have the Dallas Cowboys, who enter the game with a 6-3 record, 1 game back of New York and Washington for the lead in the NFC East. And as things stood, they were the current number 5 seed in the conference. Dallas was a very good team, having scored more points than any team in the NFC, having the 3rd best offense in football, and having a point differential of plus 89, which was the highest in the conference and was the 2nd highest in the NFL, only behind the reigning AFC champion New England Patriots. Dallas was one of those teams with a strong offense, as through their first 9 games of the season, they had scored 30 or more points in 6 of them. 2 out of 3 ain't bad when it comes to Meatloaf, and it also ain't bad when it comes to the number of games you're scoring 30 plus points in. This meant that if the Raiders were going to compete with the Cowboys, they were likely going to have a great showing offensively. And that was big for Los Angeles because they needed to win this game, maybe even more so than Dallas did. The Raiders entered this game with a 5-4 record. As things stood, they were out of the playoff picture, with 6 teams ahead of them having a record of 6-3 or better. Yes, Los Angeles had rebounded incredibly nicely following an 0-3 start, as they had won 5 of their last 6 games. But that 0-3 start really killed them and gave them no room for error, as they could not afford to lose 2 in a row with how competitive the AFC was. Consider this. Excluding the 1982 strike-shortened season, because the entire format was wonky, there were no divisions, and more than half the teams made the playoffs, since the NFL-AFL merger in 1970, only 3 AFC teams have made it to the playoffs sitting at or below 500 after 10 weeks. And the only teams to do so were division winners, where, at the time after 10 weeks, the division leader was sitting at 500 or worse. So someone had to make it by default. That didn't apply to the AFC or the AFC West in 1986. So the Raiders absolutely had to have this game based on history, or their season might be dead in the water. And part of why the Raiders were in somewhat of a precarious position was because of this man right here, their starting quarterback and a former first-round pick from 1980, Marc Wilson. I said the Raiders entered the game with a 5-4 record after starting 0-3. The fourth loss was the game before this, the game you've been watching, where Wilson was absolutely terrible. In Week 9, in front of a home crowd at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, Wilson and the Raiders took on the Denver Broncos, and the Raiders lost the game by a final score of 21-10. Perhaps the biggest reason they lost the game was because of the play of Marc Wilson, who not only got sacked 4 times, but threw a whopping 4 interceptions, including a critical pick 6 in the fourth quarter with 2 minutes left, with the Raiders trailing 14-10. Wilson was already on a short leash, as he was super inconsistent throughout the start of the 1986 season. But that Bronco game in particular was abysmal. He could not afford to have a repeat performance of that in order to beat the Cowboys. He just couldn't. Raider fans were already on edge because Wilson was never fully embraced due to his first-round pick status and his poor play, and because many Raider fans wanted the team to start the veteran Jim Plunkett at quarterback instead, since he played better and led the team to 2 Super Bowl wins. So you could imagine how bad things would get if this man right here, Marc Wilson, played like he did against the Cowboys and destroyed their season in the process. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The good news for the Raiders is that at the halftime break, they were only down by a score of 10-3. They were only down by 1 possession. Obviously, you don't want to be trailing at the half. You'd rather be up than behind, but you are still very much in the game, as it could have been a heck of a lot worse, especially considering what happens when we get to the bad news, which is that Marc Wilson was absolutely terrible. If you thought he couldn't play any worse than he played against the Broncos, oh, you would be completely wrong. How wrong you would be. Because in the first half of that game against the Cowboys, as you're watching right now, everything for Marc Wilson was ugly with a capital U. You could argue that this was the worst start by any Raiders quarterback ever at the time, and I don't think anyone would disagree with you. Wilson finished that first half going 4 for 14, completing a grand total of 28% of his passes for 37 yards. He fumbled and was sacked 3 times and lost 17 yards on those sacks. So in terms of net passing yards, Marc Wilson had 20. 30 minutes of football and 20 net passing yards, or way less than 1 per minute. And to top it all off, he had no touchdowns and 3 interceptions, with 1 pass getting picked off by Ron Fellows and 2 getting picked off by the league leader in interceptions the previous year in 1985, Pro Bowler and AP second-team All-Pro, Everson Walls. Do the math on everything, and Marc Wilson finished the first half with 4 turnovers and a passer rating of 0.0, which is your rating if you just don't even show up. Seriously, you cannot do worse than 0.0. There is no negative number which your passer rating can go to. That is the floor. That is the absolute lowest of the low. Marc Wilson was actively costing the Raiders the game with his poor play, and was costing them their season in the process. And when Raider fans across the country were watching this game, oh man, they were furious. You can imagine the curse words that were uttered every time Wilson let go of the ball. You can imagine people screaming to their friends or screaming at the TV about how bad of a quarterback he was. You can imagine stuff being broken, people being angry, and fights occurring. However, the fans can't really do anything about it. They're kinda stuck. Sure, if the game was in Los Angeles, they could boo and chant and voice their displeasure and make it clear to the coaching staff that they want Jim Plunkett in at quarterback and want Marc Wilson to be yanked. But even that doesn't directly impact the coach's decision and the team's decision to ride or die with someone. They were screwed. And for one fan who was watching this performance unfold on his TV set at home, that wasn't good enough. Because one fan, like many Raider fans, was watching the game at home and was yelling at his TV. That was a man by the name of Steve Hill, who lived in Porterville, California. Not much is known about Hill aside from this, and especially because that's a common name, I can't say I know at all what he was up to before this, or what he's up to now. I couldn't find anything. But Hill was livid at the halftime break. And that's when Hill decided to make a phone call. Not to his friend or to a family member to vent about the performance, but rather to the operator. When Hill dialed for the operator, he told the switchboard operator to put him through to none other than owner Al Davis. He knew that Davis was there and was in his suite watching the game, and he knew that Davis had influence on the decisions, and he wanted to speak directly to Raiders owner Al Davis and tell him, quite bluntly, to play Jim Plunkett over Marc Wilson. Now, you would think that this story does not go anywhere. You would think that the operator would not get him in contact with Al Davis, or if for some crazy reason, the operator actually complied with the request to get him in touch with the owner of the Raiders at Texas Stadium to talk about the performance of this man right here, Marc Wilson, that no one would be crazy enough to pick up the phone. But what's insane about this story is that somehow, I kid you not, this plan actually worked. The switchboard operator actually didn't tell Hill that they couldn't do that. The switchboard operator connected Hill to Al Davis up in the owner's box of Texas Stadium. And then, if that wasn't crazy enough, someone actually picked up the phone and didn't hang up right away. In the middle of the game, Steve Hill, a random Raider fan watching this all unfold, was now in touch with and was now in direct contact with the Raiders brass. Now, Davis didn't pick up the phone, but his top aide, Mike Ornstein, the marketing director, did, and Hill let Ornstein know everything. He said to Ornstein, "You just tell Al to take Wilson out and put Plunkett in. Now." 5 minutes later, guess what happened? That's right. Marc Wilson was benched, and to start the second half, in stepped this man right here, none other than Jim Plunkett. Wilson's day was done. Plunkett was in, and Steve Hill won. His words convinced the Raiders to make the switch. As Hill said, "I'll bet Mike turned to Al, said some guy was calling to say that Plunkett belonged in there, and then they did it." That's what happened. Hill happened to have a bottle of champagne in his house, and he immediately popped that thing open, thinking that, number one, he accomplished what he set out to do, number two, he couldn't believe that this actually worked, and number three, he directly influenced the game and saved the Raiders' season. Because when the final whistle sounded, sure enough, Hill was right. Plunkett deserved to be under center over Wilson, because with Plunkett in the game, everything was different. The Raiders actually had some signs of life on offense and held on to the football. The Raiders, who trailed 10-3 at the half thanks to an awful outing from Marc Wilson, ended up winning it by a final score of 17-10. With Plunkett doing his job, going 7 for 12 with 119 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a passer rating of 131.6, or for some perspective, 131.6 points higher than Marc Wilson's rating. 2 touchdown passes by Plunkett to Dokie Williams, with one tying the game in the third, and one giving the Raiders the lead 5 minutes into the fourth quarter, ended up being the difference, and got the Raiders to 6-4. Above 500 after 10 games. Hill said that he did this because he was frustrated enough that he wanted to talk to someone, and thought there was no reason that Plunkett shouldn't be in, especially after Wilson had thrown 7 interceptions in his last 3 halves of football, dating back to last week. And it was all because of Hill making the call to tell the Raiders to make the switch at quarterback. Well, not really. Turns out, as soon as Hill got done giving the Raiders a piece of his mind, Ornstein called the switchboard operator and told the person working to not put through any more stupid calls. Apparently, Ornstein never told Davis about the call, so Davis had no idea until the story broke in the media that a fan actually called his box at Texas Stadium and told him to make a quarterback change. the change was probably well planned out at halftime by head coach Tom Flores, because much like Hill, Flores had eyes and knew that Wilson couldn't be the quarterback anymore. Hill might have thought that he did something, especially considering the timing of everything, but it was purely a coincidence. Still, a cool, bizarre, and funny story that could definitely not happen today in a world where switchboard operators aren't really a thing the same way they were back in 1986. As for what happened after the game between these teams behind me right here, Jim Plunkett was inserted as the Raiders' starting quarterback for the remainder of the season, as Marc Wilson would not start another game for Los Angeles that year. And things started off pretty well. Plunkett won his first 2 starts, and he threw 5 touchdowns over those 2 starts. He got the Raiders to 8-4, so they seemed to be in cruise control going into the playoffs. And then, one of the craziest collapses in franchise history happened, as the Raiders lost their final 4 games, ended the year at 8-8, and Plunkett threw just 4 touchdowns and 7 interceptions over that stretch. Plunkett retired after the 1986 season. As for the Cowboys, they also collapsed pretty hard, as after starting the season 6-2, they ended it 7-9, losing 7 of their final 8 games to finish below 500, and truly signal the beginning of the end for Tom Landry as the head coach of the Cowboys. No real happy endings here for either team, but a crazy story nonetheless. Whether you want to believe that Hill actually made a difference or not, I think Hill lived the dream of every fan in America during this game right here by telling the Raiders in the middle of the game to make a switch at quarterback. You're telling me you can do that? You can just call up a team directly in the middle of a game and get something done? You know how often I wanted to do that during a Jaguars game? And you're telling me that Hill lived my dream? Again, even though Hill says otherwise, I'm 99.9% sure that this was just pure coincidence regarding the timing of the switch. But the fact that he got through and actually had a conversation with Raiders brass in the middle of the game, and it actually worked, to some extent at least, is something else. Because on this day in 1986, Steve Hill definitely thought that the 39-year-old Plunkett was not over the hill, and he decided to do something about it. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.